Hello everyone, and welcome to our second lecture covering phylum Arthropoda. In this lecture, we'll cover Subphylum Crustacea, and this is chapter 20 in your textbook. Crustaceans are often called the insects of the sea, and this is partially because insects, or hexapods, and crustaceans are really closely related to one another. And if you actually take both of those groups and combine them, you get a monophyletic group called Pancrustacea. And there's a hypothesis out there that the reason why they're so closely related is because hexapods are a branch off of the crustacean lineage. There is some debate as to whether this is true or not. However, there is some molecular analysis to support this claim. So as we learn more and do more, we might find that this hypothesis is true or false. Crustaceans all have a cuticle, and many of them we call it the shell. And the cuticle, like we talked about in the last lecture, is primarily composed of chitin and proteins. But many of them have also opted to incorporate calcium salts into their cuticle to give it a little bit more rigidity and strength, like we see in crabs and lobsters. There is a large dorsal cuticle in some crustaceans as well that covers multiple of their segments, and this is referred to as a carapace. So we can see an example of a carapace here in this picture of a crab. That kind of dorsal shield plating that you first see that makes up the vast majority of a crab is their carapace. And you can also see an example of a carapace down here in this cartoon of a lobster. This kind of shield plating that's at their anterior end is their carapace. And the carapace covers many segments. So obviously crustaceans are segmented. In crustaceans, for the most part, they have a pair of appendages for each of their segments. So you can see that in this picture of the lobster as well, that all of their abdominal segments have a pair of appendages, and then you can't really see the segments that lie underneath the carapace, but the vast majority of these 13 segments also have a pair of appendages associated with them. In the ancestral form, all of these appendages would have been biramous. Some crustaceans have since lost their biramous appendages and instead have uniramous appendages, but the common ancestor of all crustaceans would have had biramous appendages on all of their segmentation, and they would have been fully segmented. Now, modern day crustaceans, for the most part, have 2 or 3 tagmata. They can have a head, thorax, and abdomen, or they can have a cephalothorax and an abdomen. And an example of a cephalothorax abdomen you can see in actually both of these pictures, where the lobster, you can see that they're marking out the cephalothorax and the abdomen here. And then in crabs, their cephalothorax makes up the vast majority of their body that you can see covered by that carapace, and their abdomen is highly reduced. There's only 2 segments that lie really, really close to the cephalothorax, but they do also have an abdomen. So all crustaceans, no matter what their tagmata, they all derive from a fully segmented ancestor. And we'll actually see an example of a modern day crustacean that still has full segmentation and has biramous appendages. So it's thought to resemble, very closely resemble the common ancestor of all crustaceans. Crustaceans also have 2 pairs of antennae and 2 pairs of maxilla. So you can see that in this picture as well. The first pair of antennae are here, and they're shorter and lie closer to the mouth. And the second pair of antennae in this lobster are these kind of longer appendages, which we normally can see very prominently if you've ever seen a lobster in real life. And they also have 2 pairs of maxillae, which you can see here in this picture as well. I'm not going to put a line around it because they're really small, but there's 2 pairs there. And then they also have 1 pair of mandibles, which are in this image a little bit anterior to the maxillae. Crustaceans can be marine. For the most part, they are marine, but they can also be freshwater or terrestrial, and we'll explore some examples of those. They can be predators, suspension feeders, scavengers, or even what I'm calling farmers. So there's an example of a crab, and I'll show you a picture of this later. It's called a yeti crab, and they actually cultivate chemosynthetic bacteria on hairs on on some of their appendages, and then they eat those chemosynthetic bacteria. So they're almost like farming the bacteria more than catching them as suspension feeders or anything like that. And some examples of crustaceans you're probably familiar with are lobsters, crabs, shrimp, krill, barnacles, roly-polies, and water fleas. A lot of the work on crustacean anatomy and physiology has been done in crayfish. And so what we'll be talking about for the next couple of slides heavily pertains to crayfish, but the subphylum Crustacea is very, very diverse. So some of the things that we learn about crustaceans by looking at crayfish will also apply to some other species of crustaceans, and then it won't apply to others. But we'll look at some different examples of classes and orders of crustaceans a little later on. So we're looking at the crayfish. They have a carapace that covers their cephalothorax. In some species of crustacean, their carapace will cover their cephalothorax and their abdomen. Others, it'll just cover their thorax, and then some it'll cover their head, thorax, and abdomen. It just depends on the species. In a crayfish, their abdomen is not covered by the cephalothorax, and instead, each segment of their abdomen is covered by something called a tegrum, which is a dorsal plate that lies on top of the segment. And then they have these lateral plates called lateral pleurites, which are shown here and here. And that's how they're able to protect each of their abdominal segments. So each of the segments has a pair of appendages for the most part, and even those that you can't see underneath the carapace. And in the ancestor of all crustaceans, they had a biramous appendage for each of those segments. Now, some crustaceans have maintained their biramous appendages, or they may have lost some and maintained some, or they've lost them altogether. But when we're looking at a biramous appendage, it's composed of three main parts. We have our protopod, which is that kind of first shared part of the appendage before the branching occurs. And then after the protopod, it branches off into two parts called the exopod, which is the more lateral part of the appendage. And then we have our endopod, which is the distal part of the appendage. And then on the kind of anterior to all of that, or on the more dorsal side of that, all of that, we have the gills. And we'll talk about the gills a little bit in a couple more slides. So many crustaceans, like I mentioned, have lost their biramous appendages and instead now have uniramous appendages. And this is a derived characteristic because all crustaceans came from a biramous appendaged ancestor. And there have been many, many modifications in the appendages of crustaceans. If you could name it, there's an appendage for it. There's appendages for swimming, for sensing, for feeding, for reproduction, for gas exchange. There's appendage for pretty much everything. And you can see different modifications in the appendages to better suit whatever task they have. Your book has a lot of images of these different appendages, but you can even see them down here in this example of a crayfish. They have clearly these large pincers or chela on some of these front appendages. They have their specialized appendages for eating, specialized appendages for walking, and then there's, of course, appendages for locomotion. And in crayfish and in lobsters and things like that, this appendage for locomotion is called a telson, and that's this piece here. And then they have these uropods that are on the sides that kind of give it that fan-like look. And this is all to help the organism swim around. So this is clearly very specialized for swimming in the water. And then the telson is also where the anus is located. So they have a complete gut, a mouth, intestines, and an anus. Crustaceans can use a variety of methods to undergo gas exchange. In terrestrial crustaceans, they can use trachea, pseudotrachea, or lungs, and in aquatic crustaceans, they'll oftentimes have gills. And then there are some crustaceans that have both gills and lungs if they spend a significant amount of time in both the water and on land. So when we're looking at the gills in aquatic crustaceans, they have a thin cuticle that covers their gills, and it's thin enough to allow for gas exchange, but it also allows for some protection because it's still a cuticle, right? And so the gills are located on the dorsal side of the appendages. So you can see that here in this cartoon. Here are the gills, and they're connected to the rest of the appendage via the protopod. So they're kind of all one unit. And a lot of crustaceans will house their gills in something called the gill cavity, which is there are two kind of spaces on either side of the crustacean. And you can see that down here, these feathery material like this here is the gill, and then this kind of space behind it, this space here, or maybe draw a darker color. This space here is the gill cavity. And the gill cavity is often covered by the carapace. So you can't really see the carapace here because they've cut it back and removed it so that you can see the gills. But the carapace is back here and here, right? So it will cover that whole area on both sides to cover the gill cavities. And you can also see the appendages in this picture as well. So the appendage back here. So this gill here would actually be attached to this appendage, which in all likelihood, based on its location, is probably some sort of walking leg. And this is present in a lot of larger crustaceans, but some smaller crustaceans, they don't have lungs or trachea or gills or anything like that. Instead, they just undergo gas exchange via diffusion. So crustaceans have an open circulatory system, and their coelom has been filled with hemolymph. And so this is now called a hemocoel. So they do have true coeloms that just have fluid, no hemolymph incorporated near their excretory organs and their gonads, but everywhere else their coelom has been filled with hemolymph. And how the circulatory system works in crustaceans is they have a single chambered dorsal heart that pumps blood through the arteries. So it pumps blood through here and to wherever it needs to go. So whatever tissues need the oxygen. And then the deoxygenated blood will return via the veins to the central part of the body to something called the sternal sinus. And from the sternal sinus, the deoxygenated blood will be shuttled to the gills where it will become oxygenated. And then the oxygenated blood returns to an area near the heart called the pericardial sinus. And from here, the blood will enter into the heart via the ostium, which there are two. There's one on this side and one on this side. And the blood will enter the heart, and the heart will pump it through the body again. So that's how this whole process works. And the blood in crustaceans can contain either hemoglobin, which has the metal iron in it, or it can be hemocyanin, which has cyanide instead of iron. So hemocyanin will actually appear blue, whereas hemoglobin will actually appear as red. Aquatic crustaceans can use their gills for more than just respiration. They can also use them for excretion. So what they'll do is they'll remove their nitrogenous waste by just diffusing it directly from their gills into the water around them. So they do have another organ that's involved in the excretory process, but instead of removal of nitrogenous waste, it's used for osmoregulation. And these are called either the antennal or maxillary glands. And they're located in the head, so you can see it here in this picture. And it has an opening. And if that opening opens near the antenna, then it's an antennal gland. And if it opens near the maxilla, then it's a maxillary gland. And how these work is there's a lot of hydrostatic pressure in the hemocoel, and that forces the fluid into this area of the gland called the end sac. And as the fluid is being pushed into the end sac and traveling through the end sac, all of the salts that the organism needs, glucose and amino acids and water, will be reabsorbed. And then any of the waste that it doesn't need will be maintained. Then the waste, which is now called the filtrate, will travel through this tubule here. So it's really windy tubule, all the way to the bladder. And then once it's in the bladder, the urine will then be excreted via the pore that opens either near the antenna or near the maxilla. Crustaceans have two major muscle types for locomotion, and both of these muscle types are striated muscle. So they have their flexor muscles and their extensor muscles. And if you take an anatomy and physiology, you're probably already familiar with these terms. The flexor muscles move an appendage towards the body, so flexing, and then the extensor muscles move the appendage away from the body, so extending. And both of these muscles work antagonistic to one another. Then we also have a well-developed nervous system in crustaceans. And so they have a couple of components. They have a supraesophageal ganglia, which is here, and it's the brain of the crustacean. So this guy here. And they also have a subesophageal ganglia, which is located here. And both of these ganglia together provide nerves to pretty much everything that's in the head area. So to nerves to the eyes, the antennas, the mouth, the antennal glands, etc., etc. Anything that's in the head region, they provide nerves to that. And they also have a double ventral nerve cord. In this picture, they're showing you an example of that, kind of that white string, almost like beads, that runs down the ventral side of the crustacean. And this ventral nerve cord provides a pair of ganglia for every segment of the organism. So in this picture, they've drawn them as kind of like these kind of bead-looking like segments. Those are the ganglia for each segment. And then they also provide nerves for movement to all of these different segments so that each segment can move in sync. In addition to all of this nervous tissue, crustaceans also have a variety of other organs that they can use to sense their environment. They have well-developed eyes, statocysts, tactile hairs on their cuticle to sense changes in the water and in their environment, as well as receptors for taste and smell. For the most part, crustaceans are dioecious, but there are some monoecious species. And of those that are monoecious, they can either be parthenogenic or they can require cross-fertilization. And also, for the most part, crustaceans brood their young. And you can see that in this picture here of this shrimp. All of these green balls here near the abdomen are actually the shrimp's eggs. And so what a lot of shrimp and lobsters and crabs like that will do is they will either harbor their eggs near their abdomen or near their cephalothorax or in their actual claws, and they carry their eggs around with them. And this allows them to protect their young until they hatch and are ready to be independent. Once the young hatch from the eggs, they can either emerge as kind of miniature, immature versions of the adult, and this is a form of direct development, or they can hatch as a larval stage, which is a form of indirect development. If a crustacean undergoes indirect development, then they have to undergo a process of metamorphosis to reach their adult stage. And the most common larval stage that we see in crustaceans that undergo metamorphosis is this nauplius larval stage. And the nauplius larva is actually ancestral to all crustaceans. So the common shared ancestor of all crustaceans had this nauplius larval stage in its life cycle. And the nauplius larvae have 3 pairs of appendages for swimming and a medial eye. You can't really see it very well in this picture because it's kind of small, but in a couple of slides you'll see a blown up picture of what an actual nauplius larva looks like, and you can better see these characteristics. And then as the larva is undergoing growth, it will go through a series of molts. And with each molt, it will gain another type of appendage. And the appendages that it has, or the appendages that it gains, will become specialized and changed into the appendages that it needs as the adult. So as we're going through the process, eventually we'll get to the adult form that is familiar to us that we know of. Whether the crustacean undergoes direct or indirect development, they still have to undergo molting and ecdysis. So molting is the making of a larger cuticle after ecdysis has occurred, and ecdysis is the shedding of the old cuticle. And both of these processes are required for growth and also for the organism to protect itself from predators and disease and other things like that. The process of ecdysis is actually triggered by environmental cues. So it can be changes in water temperature or salinity or various other factors. And that environmental cue will start a cascade that will start to decrease the level of molt inhibiting hormone. And that molt inhibiting hormone is what's normally present that keeps the organism from undergoing ecdysis. But once the levels of this hormone decrease, the levels of ecdysone will increase. And ecdysone is the hormone that's responsible for initiating this process of ecdysis. So as the levels of ecdysone increase, the organism will start to undergo the ecdysis process and shed its old cuticle. And then after it's finished undergoing ecdysis, the amount of ecdysone in the body will decrease and the amount of molt inhibiting hormone will increase so that it's not constantly undergoing ecdysis. The subphylum Crustacea is incredibly diverse, and so we're not going to talk about every single order and class that belongs to this subphylum, but we'll talk about a few to give you some examples of the diversity that's out there. So we'll begin with class Arthropoda, and ostracods have a bivalve carapace. You can see that really well in this picture here. Here's one half of their carapace, and then here's the other half of their carapace. And because of this, they have almost like a clam-like appearance to them. So they almost look like a clam that has these like legs sticking out. And they also resemble another type of crustacean that we'll talk about in a couple of slides called Diplostraca. And this group contains something called the water fleas or Daphnia, which you may have heard of because a lot of studies have been done with Daphnia. They have a fused thorax and abdomen, which in this cartoon makes that pretty clear. You can't really see where one part ends and one part begins. Like, where's the abdomen? Where's the thorax? Where's the head? Like, it all looks like one blob, and that's because it's all been fused together. One interesting thing about ostracods is that when it's time to undergo mating, some of them will emit light to attract mates, so they're bioluminescent. And they can occur in both marine and freshwater environments. And they're very, very important in both of these environments, and they're very abundant because they make up a fundamental level of the food web in these aquatic environments. So they are a form of zooplankton or zooplankton, as some people call them. You'll hear me say that term a lot over the next couple of slides because the zooplankton are primary consumers, and they're also a major food source for a variety of other organisms. So the health of the zooplankton in an aquatic environment is a really good indicator of the success of that area, of that environment. Zooplankton are suspension feeders, and they can be scavengers, so they can eat photosynthetic bacteria and other microorganisms, and they can also scavenge off of dead material in the water column. And there are a lot of fossils of these ostracods all over the world, and they're a really good indicator of where you can find oil deposits because, of course, oil is made of a lot of carbon from ancient organisms, and so where these are located is a good indicator that you might find some oil there. Remipedia is a small class of cave-dwelling crustaceans, and these crustaceans are thought to closely resemble the ancestral form for all crustaceans. So the shared common ancestor of all crustaceans is thought to look like these guys. And this is because they have no tegmatization, and they also have a pair of lateral biramous appendages on every single one of their segments, and all of their appendages are virtually identical to one another. So you can see that in this picture here in their cartoon, they're showing you those appendages. They're a bit hard to see, it's a little small, but you can see the protopod here that splits into the exopod and endopod. And you can also see it if you look at this picture down here. These appendages, you can probably see a little bit better that they definitely are biramous. And one really interesting thing about this class is that the first identified venomous crustacean belongs to this class. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Members of the class Brachiopoda get their name from the leaf-like legs that they use for respiration. And these leaf-like legs are actually called phylopodia. So you can actually see them here, these kind of leaf-like appendages in this area are the Phyllopodia, and then they're also present on these brachiopods as these extensions towards the posterior end. And they use those for respiration. They can also use their Phyllopodia for suspension feeding and for locomotion. Most brachiopods live in freshwater environments where they play a major role in the food web. So these are also a important zooplankton class. And one of the most famous brachiopods is Daphnia, or the water flea, which is an example is this guy. Copepods, or organisms that belong to the subclass Copepoda, are some of the most diverse and abundant crustaceans on the planet. They have no carapace and they have no abdominal appendages, which you can see in this picture here. The only appendages they have are their antennules that are on their anterior end, and then a pair of appendages at their posterior end, and that's about it. They do also have a medial eye, which they retain from their Nauplius larval stage. And so most crustaceans, as they're undergoing development, will lose that Nauplius eye, but instead the copepods have retained that eye into adulthood. Copepods can either have symbiotic relationships with other organisms, they can be parasitic, or they can be free living, and they are a major component of the food web in aquatic environments. So they are another important zooplankton. They have also economic and medicinal importance as well. So they play a major role as a primary consumer, which helps to keep the amount of photosynthetic algae and things down in aquatic systems. And they can be filter feeders or they can be scavengers. And then they also play an important role as prey for other aquatic animals. Like we've seen in the other zooplankton, they work in a similar way in the food web. And then they can also be parasitic themselves, so they can attach themselves to other crustaceans or to vertebrates or invertebrates and act as parasites. And then they can also be intermediate hosts to other parasites. So they've been known to be intermediate hosts for human tapeworm and nematodes. So they have a lot of different importance on multiple levels. Members of the subclass Cirripedia may be some of my least favorite organisms on the planet, and that's just because the way they look is to me really, really gross, and it messes with my phobia. But they are a group of sessile crustaceans that includes barnacles, and these were previously thought to have actually been mollusks because they don't look anything like the other crustaceans that we've talked about. And so people thought they were more closely related to maybe clams and mussels than they were to, like, say, shrimp or crabs. But in actuality, they're not mollusks. They're crustaceans, right? And they were able to figure this out by looking at the larva. And so when you look at the larva, they have a Nauplius larval stage. And so when I said we could see a better picture, this is a picture of that larva. And you can see that eye here. And then there are 3 pairs of appendages. So one here, and then one here. And so that allowed them to figure out, oh, these barnacles are not mollusks, they're actually crustaceans. Once the Nauplius larvae settle to a surface, they will undergo a series of molts and they undergo metamorphosis, and they will eventually form these calcareous plates that make up their shell. And so those plates, here we go. Here you can see them here. So they have their outer domicile, and then they have these 2 plates, one on this side and one on this side, that kind of help to close the organism in and protects them from any harm. And then they use their legs that they had as larvae become modified into feeding structures. And so that's what we're looking at here. These appendages were once legs, but they're now used for filter feeding. Most of these, most members of this subclass are marine, and we talked about a good example being barnacles, and they can cause major problems economically and for anybody who has a boat, because these barnacles can form on pretty much any hard surface. And if they form on a boat, it can cause that ship or boat to have a lot of drag. And so people commonly have to make sure you dry dock boats and remove the barnacles off the sides of the boat. And then there's a lot of investments in trying to find ways to make sure that these barnacles do not become established on boats and on docks and things like that. So if you've ever been to the coast at low tide, you've definitely seen these guys. They're all over the place. Finally, we have the most diverse group of crustaceans, class Malacostraca. And there are a lot of different organisms that belong within this class, including skeleton shrimp, pill bugs, krill, true shrimp, lobsters, crabs, you name it, it's a lot of crustaceans that fall under this class. But we're just going to talk about two particular orders. We're going to talk about Isopoda and Decapoda. And before we move on, I just wanted to point out the picture of the Yeti crab I mentioned before in like the first slide. This is the Yeti crab that has those hairs where they cultivate the chemosynthetic bacteria so they can eat them. That's what this guy looks like. So kind of cool. Isopods can live in freshwater, marine, or terrestrial environments, and actually, order Isopoda is contains the only truly terrestrial crustacean, and those are the pill bugs, or people call them sow bugs or roly-polies. And if you've never seen one, this is an example of what they look like. And even though they're truly terrestrial, so they live their entire lives on land, they must live in moist areas. And this is because their cuticle is not like those of insects, where they're really good at holding in moisture. Their cuticle is not very good at maintaining moisture. So if they're in really dry environments, they'll dry out and die. So this is why you find roly-polies underneath like downed logs or underneath leaf litter where there's a lot of moisture so they can maintain the moisture within their tissues. They do not have a carapace. They do have compound eyes, and you might have to leave this PowerPoint and zoom in on this picture, but you can actually see the roly-poly's eye here. Of course, they have one on this side too, but you can't see that one. But you can really see the eye of this roly-poly if you zoom in on this picture. For aquatic isopods, they have gills on their legs, on their abdominal legs. For terrestrial isopods, they'll have pseudotrachea on their abdominal legs instead. And the pseudotrachea are less complex than the trachea that we see in insects, but they behave in a similar way, so they're for respiration. And many isopods are able to actually roll up into a ball to protect themselves, hence why we call them roly-polies sometimes. And you can see an example of one rolling up down here. So if you ever find a roly-poly outside and if you pick it up and you perturb it a little bit, the terrestrial ones, at least a lot of times in Georgia and stuff, will roll up. Not all of them can do this, but some of them can, and it's especially common in the terrestrial ones that you can find in your house and in your garden and things like that. There's another famous isopod out there, and this is the tongue louse. And this guy is famous because they crawl into the mouths of fish and cut the fish's tongue out, and they basically replace the fish's tongue. So they'll eat food and they'll travel with the fish, and then they behave like the fish's tongue. So they're really weird and kind of creepy. I've included a video at the end of this presentation if you want to see what they look like. But it's kind of weird to imagine you catch a fish and in the inside, instead of seeing a tongue, there's a little louse peeking back at you. Lastly, we have order Decapoda, and we won't spend a whole bunch of time talking about the different body plans of decapods because there's just a lot of diversity out there. In just the 4 pictures I presented here, it just gives you a very, very minor taste of the different types of body plans that decapods can have. And then also, we've spent the vast majority of the first half of this presentation talking about decapods, whether we realized it or not. When we were talking about the anatomy and physiology of crustaceans, we used crayfish as our model, and crayfish are decapods, so we've basically been covering decapods this whole time. Decapods get their name from the fact that they have 5 pairs of walking legs, and so their name means 10 feet, so if you have 5 pairs of walking legs. they have 10 feet. And many of these walking legs can be modified with chela. And chela are those pincer-like projections on the end. So you can see that here in this diagram. And then you can also see the very apparent chela in a lot of these samples. So in lobsters, of course, their chela are really famous. They have two large chela on their first pair of walking legs. Crayfish, they actually have chela on more than just their first pair of walking legs. They'll have some smaller chela on their second, third, fourth pair of walking legs. And then there's an example here of this pistol shrimp. You can see they have one really large chela on one side of their body. And then on the other side, you can't really see it, but their other corresponding appendage on the other side has a really, really small chela. And this really large chela is what makes pistol shrimp actually so interesting. If you want to know more information, I would go and look them up. They're some of the fastest animals on the planet, and they use that chela to basically stun their prey. They rapidly fire their claw at their prey, and it stuns them, and that helps them to catch them. They're really, really cool. And then you can also see the very large chela here in this giant Japanese spider crab. So these are a bit terrifying for a lot of people because of how large they are, but they have these really large chela on their front two walking legs. And then I include this picture here of this hermit crab, mainly because I thought it was pretty funny how we have a crustacean on a crustacean. So you can take a look at the shell of this hermit crab, which is a crustacean, and on its shell it has all these barnacles, which are also crustaceans. So it's like a crustacean hitching a ride on another crustacean, which I thought was kind of funny. And then, in addition to the 5 pairs of walking legs, crustaceans also have 3 pairs of maxillipeds, which are these feeding structures near the mouth that are responsible for gripping the prey and holding onto it and manipulating that prey. And so you can see that here in this picture, the maxillipeds are these extensions. So this one, and this little guy right here. And we're generally, as humans, very familiar with decapods because we eat a lot of them. Decapods includes lobsters, crabs, true shrimp, and crayfish, which are all very popular in cuisine all around the world. This concludes our second lecture on arthropods. You can go ahead and start reading chapter 20, the introduction 20.1 and 20.2. And then I've also included some videos here. One is a crayfish molting. So if you've never seen an actual molting process and you can stomach it, there's a good time-lapse video of how that process occurs. One of copepod swimming. So if you've never seen those in person, you can actually see what they look like and how they move around. And then the next one of the giant aquatic isopod is really kind of interesting. It's a very short video from the NOAA Research Center, and it's like a foot-long aquatic, almost like a giant roly-poly bug. It's actually kind of cute swimming around, so I recommend that video. And then the last video is of the tongue louse that we talked about. So the isopod that replaces the tongue of the fish and basically lives as the fish's tongue for the rest of its life. Okay, so I'll see you for the next lecture, where will be our last arthropod lecture covering hexapods or the insects.